The Twin Towers of the World Trade Center were among the greatest achievements in history. On September 11, 2001, both of these towers fell at near free-fall acceleration. We're told that it was due to fire, but no such thing has ever happened before or since. Early on, so-called experts told us that jet fuel fires had melted the steel. We heard this from BBC, Scientific American, Nova, and from Osama bin Laden himself. But that can't happen. Diffuse hydrocarbon fires don't melt steel. At least one 9/11 Commission chairman still thinks the steel melted, though. So does the leading Republican presidential candidate, Mitt Romney. After the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, the question was put to the World Trade Center's design engineer, John Skilling. What would happen if an airliner hit the tower, he was asked. He said, there'd be a big fire and a lot of people would be killed, but the building structure would still be there. That's because all tall buildings are designed to resist fire. The World Trade Center had fireproofing, which had been tested and certified by Underwriters Laboratories. It also had steel components that were tested and certified by Underwriters Laboratories. This World Trade Center fire resistance testing was confirmed to me directly by UL CEO, who said, we tested the steel and it did beautifully, and we tested the code requirements. Those code requirements required far more fire resistance than the buildings actually exhibited. So how did it happen? In 2005, the government finally put out its World Trade Center report. The NIST agency is part of the U.S. Department of Commerce, which at the time was run by George W. Bush's good buddy and oil executive Donald Evans. The report is very large and very redundant. And NIST's stated goals were to explain why and how World Trade Center buildings 1, 2, and 7 collapsed. NIST did a few tests to determine the answers, but NIST did not end up explaining how the towers fell, only how collapse was supposedly initiated. NIST's final story can be broken down into 7 general steps for each of the 2 buildings. These steps are listed here. We'll examine each of these to see if NIST's story holds water. The first is that columns were severed, but really only a small percentage of columns were severed compared to the design requirements. The second claim was that loads were redistributed. NIST says that some loads were increased and some were decreased. But again, according to design claims, this should not have been a problem. NIST then said that fireproofing was widely dislodged. In fact, they made it clear that the towers would not have collapsed if the fireproofing had not been widely dislodged. So NIST must have really done a lot to prove this critical claim. But the fact is that NIST's draft report said nothing about it at all. The final report, however, included a 12-page appendix describing a shotgun test. The shotgun test amounted to 15 blasts at samples in a plywood box. Could a Boeing 767 be turned into many thousands of shotgun blasts? NIST did nothing to prove this concept. But thankfully, the good people at Purdue University were able to prove NIST wrong.
This reverse angle shot visualizes the important damage sustained by some of the core columns. Using a camera with a distant hither plane, this sequence simultaneously visualizes the 2 floors that sustained most direct impact damage.
No shotgun blasts there, and the energy to do this was really just too high. NIST, in fact, disproved its own theory with its shotgun tests. Despite this problem, we should ask, how hot could the steel have become? NIST says that the gas temperatures in the World Trade Center towers were as high as 1,000 degrees Celsius, and the highest steel temperatures were about 760 degrees. Again, no melting could occur at these temperatures, and probably no softening either. But NIST physical tests on steel temperatures show that the steel temperatures were even lower than that. They were really only about 250 degrees Celsius. NIST seemed to have selected the wrong samples for these tests. What's important, though, is the temperature in the failure zone. We need to know, how long did the fires last in the failure zones? Given that they had to migrate around the core, and that took so long, there really was only 45 minutes, particularly for the North Tower, in the failure zone. After 45 minutes, how much floor sagging could occur? The tests that NIST did showed that only very slight sagging was possible, only about 3 inches. But in the computer, NIST turned this into 42 inches of dramatic sagging. To reiterate, physical tests were done by my former company with almost no fireproofing on the floors and twice the load. And as a result, the long-standing pancake theory collapsed. Let's take a look again at NIST's fire migration hypothesis. The fires were said to flare up and die down, and then in the North Tower, they moved around the core for 60 minutes. We might wonder how the east and west walls were unaffected by this. But the south wall was supposedly softened badly. So, how did the sagging floors pull exterior columns inwards and cause them to buckle? The floor assemblies formed an intense, staggered grid with the columns. The force required to pull a perimeter column inward and overcome that grid was far greater than what a sagging floor assembly could provide. A surprising problem is that even NIST knows this, and within its report, it disagrees with its final story. In several sections of the report, it says that this sagging and pulling is really not possible. But NIST management resorted to 1 case out of 9 in the computer model. In this case, NIST had to strip off all the fireproofing, exaggerate the steel temperatures, apply the temperatures for twice as long as they knew existed, but first they had to disconnect all the floors. It is ludicrous but true. NIST disconnected the floors in its model and then applied a pull-in force. This is not science. We know this can't happen, but how did instability spread around the entire building perimeter? To match the evidence, that would have to happen at nearly twice the speed of sound and result in a perfectly uniform fall with no deceleration. In the false world of NIST World Trade Center computer scenarios, anything is possible. NIST avoided a lot of important evidence by simply saying global collapse ensued. What about the resistance of the floors below? What about the squibs? What about the molten metal and the intergranular melting? By ignoring all this evidence, NIST made it clear they had no intention of doing science from the start. But what would objective scientists have found? Basically, at every step of NIST's sequence, objective scientists would have found the exact opposite of what NIST had found.